Hey guys, Matt Allen here. Welcome back to Tactical Bassin. Today we are talking fishing line, talking about mono, fluoro, braid. What are the differences? What are the strengths? What are the weaknesses? When should you be using them? Because there are a lot of myths, there are a lot of misconceptions, a lot of things people don't understand about fishing line, and obviously it is the core of your entire system. It's what you're relying on to get fish in the boat. So we're gonna run through the differences and when you should be applying them. Now, just a quick update for you. I'm sure many of you have seen that there are fires in the west. Right, I mean, they're here all summer long, but right now they're severe. And a couple of those really big fires are near us. So both of our families have been evacuated. Just wanted to keep you guys in the loop, let you know what's going on in our real life. But it's okay. You know, the families are out, our valuables are out. It is what it is. We'll just wait and see. Everything looks really good. I'm thinking, you know, as long as it stays the way it is, probably another 2-3 days, we'll all be home. No big deal. It'll be in the rearview mirror. But that's why I'm standing here against the fence with Cece's boat, and I'm hours away from home. But guys, back to the fishing topic. By the way, Tim is still up there. You guys should know that. That guy doesn't get a lot of credit. Tim, most of you know, is a warden in his day job, and he's good at it. So he's up there doing evacuations, looter patrols, all those things that come with fire, but his family is out of there and they're safe. He's up there breathing all that smoke. But hopefully it'll be over here quick and Tim can get back to fishing too. All right, on to fishing line. Mono versus fluoro. I think that's the best place to start. And then we're going to throw braid into the mix. The general consensus is that monofilament is stretchy, it's visible, it has a lot of memory, a lot of downsides to it, not a lot of upsides. That's what the general consensus would tell you. I'm going to tell you up front, we're going to circle back to this, but up front, for most applications, I do not agree. I'm going to put that out there right now, and that's going to confuse a lot of people, but we're going to circle back. For now, let's start with fluoro. In general, fluorocarbon is considered to be your best option for fishing line. It's going to be the most sensitive, the lowest stretch, the least visible to the fish, etc., etc., etc. And there are a lot of truths to that, but there are also a lot of fallacies. One thing that you guys need to understand, and I'm just going to put this down right now, is that across the board, fishing line companies are not necessarily going to tell you the whole truth. There have been all sorts of independent studies done of fishing lines comparing strength, comparing stretch, and the results would fascinate you. There are monofilaments that don't stretch anywhere near as far as some fluorocarbons. There are fluorocarbons that are incredibly strong or rigid. They're hard. Other ones are incredibly soft. So the rules, the things you hear, don't necessarily apply. But in general, fluorocarbon is very, very clear if it's a pure fluorocarbon. So you can label something fluorocarbon, and it's actually just the exterior. It's just a coating that is fluorocarbon. But pure fluorocarbons, 100% fluorocarbons, are extremely clear. So if you're in a clear water situation, a lot of people lean to fluorocarbon. A lot of smallmouth fishermen focus on fluoro. A lot of spotted bass fishermen focus on fluoro. And a lot of largemouth fishermen do too. Fluoro is great, but there are some downsides. One, tying knots in it. Fluorocarbon, the harder the fluoro, the more difficult it is to tie a knot without the line getting burned. And I literally mean it'll get burned, and it creates a very weak spot on the line. So you have to be careful with your knots when you tie fluorocarbon, especially connection knots. Braid to leader. If you're using fluorocarbon as a leader, it can give you nightmares. And this has happened to some of my close friends and guys that are really good fishermen. I talked for years and years and years about making 100% switch to braid and then using leader from there. And I'm not 100%, you know, as time goes on, as time passes, you adapt your style a little bit. So I'm not 100% braid anymore, but I'll bet I am 90 to 95% braid for all applications. But I use leaders. I'm not using straight braid for more than maybe 10% of my applications. I use leader material. But if you guys notice on our videos down in the down in the video description, we link all our gear. Almost every time that I link one of the things that I'm using, I say that my main line is a Braid, and then I use a mono leader. I want to be crystal clear with you. I mean mono. And the reason why is a lot of people are going to see that, and they're going to see braided mainline and leader, and they're going to go, okay, well, I'll just use fluoro for my leader. And they do that, and they end up with breakage issues. They end up with knots that slip, knots that fail. They go to make a cast, and their entire leader just flies away. They don't know why. Fluorocarbon is much more difficult to use as a leader material than mono. However, there are differences between fluoros. So, just like every video, down in the video description, I'm going to link you a lot of different lines. I'm not going to get into the politics between brands or any of that stuff. I'm going to give you just my personal opinion. I like this line for this. I like this line for this. I found that this one is the best for frogging. I found that this one is the best for flipping. Just my personal experience. And that is all it is. Take it or leave it. I use, I don't know, maybe half a dozen brands of line. Tim uses the same brands. Sometimes we use different models though. Like Tim uses a ton of Sniper. I use a lot more Assassin. They're different. Tim loves Sniper because it's incredibly strong. It's a very hard line. And he uses more fluoro as main line than I do. He's still mostly Braid, but he uses more fluoro than I do. And that Sniper is a very, very strong line. The downside of any time you have a line that's really hard like that is they're also very rigid, and they tend to want to backlash more. So one of my main applications for fluoro is cranking. Now, I also crank on braid and leader. I go back and forth. But if I'm doing what I call finesse cranking, which is what you see us doing for smallmouth sometimes, where even though we're cranking, you know, we're using 8, 10, 12 pound fluorocarbon, and we're using small crankbaits. When I'm doing that application, that's one place where I like fluoro, because I get maximum distance, and I'm able to get a little bit deeper because I'm getting that distance. And because distance is my goal, I can't be having any backlash on my spool or any loose line. So I use Assassin because it's smoother and it's softer, and it just casts better, casts like a dream. So great lines, different applications. You see where this is headed? Now, another example is, again, back to that, using this as a leader versus using this as a leader. The argument is that fluorocarbon is clear. Fish don't see it as well. I mean, I can't argue with that. Fluorocarbon is clear, especially a pure fluorocarbon. However, most bass aren't geniuses. We are catching giants pretty regularly. You know, giant bass is what I did for a long time, literally almost decades now. Chasing giant fish, that's my passion. And I've caught almost all of them on a mono leader. They're not afraid of the line. Now, there are unique instances. You know, I look down in that water and I can see a little pebble on the bottom in 40 feet. And all of a sudden I'm like, I don't know if I should be throwing mono today. But I start with braid to mono to find out. And if I have to change, I change. The reason why I start with braid to mono is because it's such an effective system. Braid to mono is a killer. It just nails fish. It is incredibly forgiving because mono, I use Maxima on purpose. Maxima, I have nothing to do with Maxima. I've never talked to this company in my life, but that you'll notice it's the main mono that I link. I've played with a lot of monos. I used this line as a kid, left it for years, used P-line, used big game, used all sorts of different things. Ultimately, after 3 or 4 years of using different lines, circle back around. I tried Ultra Green one more time, and it stuck. And I've used Ultra Green ever since. The color of this line blends really well with 95% of the water that I find myself fishing. True crystal clear water. It doesn't blend because it has just a hint of green in it. Anything shy of that, it blends so well because, again, it's just a hint of green. A lot of monos are a darker green or even a very dark color, and those don't blend at all. They look, in my opinion, they look terrible in the water. And the Maxima is also extremely, extremely strong. I mean, what they write on there, 20 pounds. If you actually went and put this on a machine and tried to break it, I don't know where you'd end up. 27 pounds, 28 pounds, 32 pounds, I don't know. The stuff is way strong. It's also thick. You'll notice the diameters, it's a thick line. So I really don't even gauge what I'm doing by their listed line strength. I work off a diameter more than anything. So far I've rambled a ton, guys. We're gonna circle around and I'm gonna tie this up neat and clean for you. Here's what I want you to understand. I am primarily braid to mono leader. I do not believe that mono is costing me fish at all. If anything, I think it is a huge advantage. I use braid as a main line for a handful of reasons. It's strong. It lasts for so long. And I could go so in depth about which ones last longer and why they last longer and which ones are for what. But this video would end up being 30 or 40 minutes long, and a lot of it's mundane and things you don't need to know. It's taken a lifetime to gather the information about all the different lines. But I'll just tell you that when I link different things in the video description today, there's a reason that I use each one of them. Some of them I'll probably even explain in that description just to keep the length of the video short. But again, bringing it back together, braid to mono for almost everything. Adding to that, it's extremely sensitive because the braid stretches less. Braid does stretch. Sometimes you hear people say braid doesn't stretch. That's not true. It does. And as you go across the different brands, some braids stretch a ton. Some stretch more than fluoros do, but most of them don't. So because it's low stretch, it becomes very sensitive. What I love about it is that because it is so sensitive and because it is so strong, the best way I know to describe it, the way I tell people, is that it forgives a lot of sins. And what I mean by that is, if I'm using mono or fluoro, and I realize late that a fish picked up a bait, or I'm out of position, and all of a sudden I realize there's a fish on there, and I get a bad hook set, or a late hook set, or no hook set, with mono or fluoro, I'm in trouble. But braid forgives a lot of those things, because once you do finally snap that hook set, whether it's a half of a hook set or a late hook set, or you got to wind way down and it's too late for a hook set, once you do get tight on those fish because the stretch is so low, it tends to stick them anyway. It's very, very forgiving. So for beginner anglers, no beginner anglers start with braid and tie leaders. That's just not where people start, but it's where they should start, because it forgives so many things. It makes you a better angler instantly. Now the downside of braid is visibility. The fish can see it. It's not clear, right? It's a solid material. They can see it. But that's where the leader comes into play. I use that mono leader for forgiveness again, because when you get those fish close to the boat, if you've done something wrong, if your drag's too tight, if you're horsing on them because you think it's a little and then it ends up being a giant, that mono leader is a great shock absorber. It has a ton of stretch. Now there are fluorocarbons on the market you can buy that are specifically formulated to be stretchy. So if you are in a crystal clear water situation, you can still go braid to leader, but you can go to stretchy fluorocarbon and get all those same advantages of mono. Literally all of them. There's no downside. I would even say that those are better than mono. The downside though is cost. They cost way more than mono. From a fishing side, there is no downside. A stretchy fluorocarbon is a phenomenal leader material, but mono is going to cost you, a quarter or a half or a tenth of what some of those fluorocarbons will cost you. So braid to leader for almost everything. I do a lot of switching around in my braids. My favorites are regular Power Pro, very, very basic line. It's consistent. I like it a lot for my spinning rods because I'm using really low diameter, 10 or 15 pound, and it just works. It's a consistent line. In the really, really heavy applications, I tend to lean away from it because it's so rigid. It has a very low carrier count, meaning that the braid, because it's braided line, right? Literally braided line. The braid there's not very many strands to the braid, so the braid is fairly rough. You can feel it in your fingers on the line. It's a very rough line. So in the larger diameters, that roughness, if you will, becomes more apparent. Max Quattro is probably the #1 braid that I use now. I use it for most things, and I started using that about 1.5 years ago. Again, it's a fairly rough braid, lower carrier count, but it's incredibly thin for its strength, and that's what I love it for. I love it. It's a great line. And then the other one that I use the most, Suffix 832, is probably my #3. So Max Quattro being #1, regular Power Pro. I'm not even going to say that's 2 and that's 3. Those two are probably even. I use Suffix 832 a ton also. 832 is incredibly smooth. And it's got some different materials in the braid, but it's incredibly smooth. Diameter's good. So it's quieter going through the guides because it's smooth. So if you're transitioning into braid, the #1 issue you're going to have is sound. It's going to bother you in the beginning because fluoro or mono going through guides doesn't make any sound at all. Braid does. There's actual braid noise, and you can feel it. You can hear it and you can feel it. There's a little, those braids crossing those guides. There's actual vibration there, and you'll detect it in your hand in the beginning. You haven't learned to let your hand ignore that noise yet. So, Suffix 832 or one of the other, Power Pro Super Slick, or there's probably half a dozen very smooth, probably more than that, a dozen super smooth braids that will eliminate a lot of that for you as you get used to it. 832 being the #1 that I would use. Very smooth, very strong, very consistent. Downside is it loses color very quickly and becomes almost a white line. So it's very, very important that you're using leader. And I would even go a step further and run a Sharpie or a permanent marker on some of that line to keep it darker. I have less of a problem with that with my Max Quattro. It tends to last a lot longer. That's braid. Fluoros, I'm going to keep it simple. Like I said, I like Assassin for my more reactive applications, which is almost the only thing I use fluoro for. I'll occasionally use Sniper, but Tim uses it far more than I do, and I'm sure he's got his own set of reasons for why he does that. I also use Seaguar Red Label. Is just inexpensive but consistent, great line. I also use a BrazeX. Invisex is not a line that I've ever personally just really latched onto, but a BrazeX is a good line. And it takes a knot pretty well. So if you do want more of a budget fluorocarbon that you can still get away with using as a leader material, it's not a bad one, but you need to really get your knots wet and be careful when you cinch them down. And then connection knots matter. There's 50 different connection knots out there. There's so many people on the internet that have an opinion about which one you should be tying. I'm not going to argue. I'm going to tell you that I tie a blood knot. I don't tie a regular blood knot. On my main lines, I tie a blood knot with 9 loops each direction. We've done whole videos on this, but if you don't want to take the time to search for them, here's the gist of it. I tie my blood knot, 9 loops each direction. Unless I'm going to really light line, 10 pound, 15 pound, fluorocarbon, my spinning rod applications. Then I go up on the braid, down on the mono or fluoro. So take that braid up to say 10 loops, and I go mono or fluoro down to 7 or 8 loops. And then I go to cinch it, and I wet it, cinch it, and if they're not cinching, if it pulls through, no big deal, Then I go to 10 loops, 7 loops, 11 loops, 6 loops, until I get a good cinch. And then I test it, and I actually go all the way as to break it, just to know that I was good, and then I tie that exact same combination again. The benefit of a blood knot is that it's simple once you learn how to do it, but more importantly, you can see when you tie it wrong. I can see that my loops aren't right, that they overlap, or I can see that they are right. I can see if my mono or fluoro got burned. It shows right at the head of the knot. You can visibly see it. That's one of the best things about a blood knot, is that if you tie a bad knot, it doesn't require a fish to find out. Now, there are people that would argue all day for the FG knot and for the Alberto knot and for 20 other knots, and I'm not going to argue. I mean, everybody has a preference, but I'll tell you, again, I go back to we catch a lot of big fish. I don't know that I know anybody who's pulling any harder on a line than I am. I mean, especially with some of that recent stuff we showed you with the giant stripers. Those were all across a blood knot. I'm not saying it's the strongest. I'm saying it's consistent, and that I can see when it's tied correctly versus incorrectly, and it's a solid knot. That is why I use it, and I've yet to meet the fish that is just going to destroy that thing. Now, I will say a knot that I think is better than my blood knot is a nail knot. I think it's one step above, but it's much, much harder to tie on the water. And at the end of the day, as awesome as bass are, and as much respect as we have for bass, bass are not that strong in the world of predator fish. I don't know that you need a nail knot in bass fishing. There's guys that are going to be like, what? I break line. I break line too. I've broken 80-pound line on a bass. I've broken 65-pound line on a bass so many times. I've broken 30-pound leader material on a bass on a straight pole, and it was a big bass. But generally speaking, it's not going to happen. Bass just don't pull that hard. So if you tie a consistent knot, you tie a quality knot, you tie it in quality line, and you don't play that fish like you're out of your mind, you don't lock your drag down on 6-pound line, you don't play a loose line on 30-pound line, it's all going to work out. You'll be just fine. You will land a giant bass. Guys, I know that was a lot of rambling about when and why and how to use each one. And actually, I'm going to ramble a little bit longer because I almost completely skipped using mono as a main line. I'm going to keep it simple. I hate mono as a main line. I do. Mono is very stretchy across the board. It stretches. It has a lot of memory. So the coils will want to build up on the spool just like a hard fluorocarbon. Maxima Ultra Green is my favorite mono. I don't know that you could make me throw it as a main line. I used to do it. I used to throw it as my main line for swim baits. I caught a lot of big fish on it. Caught a handful of double digits on it. In fact, I caught the biggest fish of my life, my 17.2, on Maxima Ultra Green as a main line. But would I do it again? Absolutely not. Mono is too forgiving. It's too absorbing. It absorbs your feel. You have less sensitivity, you have more stretch, you have more give, and all those things come into play at the wrong time. A lot of topwater guys still like mono. Here's what I say to that, because people are shocked to find out that Tim and I both throw our topwaters, especially our treble topwaters, on braid. Sometimes with a short leader, sometimes without. Go to a softer rod. All the things you're trying to gain from a mainline mono, I gain by taking braid and putting it on a rod that's 1 power lighter than I would have used. Now I have a more flex in the rod, more give, more stretch, if you will. But when it comes down to horsepower, I've still got that braid. When it comes down to strength, I've still got that braid. When it comes down to a fish trying to get its head into cover at the last second, I can pull on them. I don't see a downside. Guys, I hope that helps. Again, that video description, I'm going to put a bunch of line down there. I don't want to overwhelm you. I hope this helps and doesn't overwhelm you. We've gone a really long time, but it's an important subject. This is the core of your bass fishing. You need to understand what these lines are for and when to use them. If you want to use fluoro for your main line, you go right on ahead and do it. Be careful with the knots that you tie. You know what? And I didn't even get into my main connection knots. So again, I'll just put all that down there so you don't even have to. You don't have to watch me talk for 10 more minutes. I'll just tell you what the knots are. We'll keep it simple. Guys, I appreciate you. Appreciate you watching the video. Hopefully, if this fire goes right, we'll be home just in a few short days here. No big deal. This is part of living on one of the greatest bass fishing lakes on the planet. It's the downside. It is what it is. We live on a great fishery. We appreciate you guys. Hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel. Turn your notifications on so you know when our videos are coming out. They come out Monday, Wednesday, Friday. We'll talk to you soon.